Then suddenly he saw Greybeard's deerskin pouch laying at his side. Quickly he pulled it from his shoulder, swung it above his head, and whirled it around the world, around the world. Around and around he whirled it, and then he let it fly, just as the animal loomed over him. And it struck the bull full in the face, in the face. The long strap tangled around its horns. Maddened and confused, Saxton ran off in a frenzy, tossing his head and strewing the contents of the bag all over the ground. Teo leaned on his spear, breathing heavily, trying to rest as the crazed beast ran around in circles. Saxton jumped, then he wheeled, then he thrashed, all in an attempt to rid himself of this offensive object. Finally, with a toss of his head, the big bull sent the annoying bag flying into the grass. Now, more enraged than ever, Saxon turned, strings of foam dripping from his black lips. His nostrils flared. He lowered his head and charged. Terrified and unable to move, Teo watched him advance. Just then he saw a flash of sunlight flicker in the grass. He blinked and looked again. It was Greybeard's shining stone. With a wild leap, he tumbled across the ground and scooped it up in his hand. He jumped to his feet and turned it to the sun, shining the light directly into Saxton's eyes. The great bull slowed up. He stopped and shook his head, baffled and uncertain. Grunting in fury, Saxon turned and charged again. Teo moved towards him, flashing the brilliant light across his face, and once again Saxon backed off. He trotted around in a wide circle, venting his anger with a billowing roar. Then he came back, head down, hooves pounding and shaking the earth. Again, Teo had caught the sunlight on the stone and flashed it in his eyes. The great bull wavered, then stopped, as if facing a wall of fire. Trembling with rage, Saxon pawed the ground and jabbed his horns into the dirt. Teo followed him, forcing him back with the blinding light. Frustrated, the bull swung his head from side to side, but Teo just kept after him. He gave him little chance to rest. Finally, the fire in his eyes was gone. His head drooped. Unable to understand this baffling brightness, the bull billowed his vengeance to the sky, panted heavily, and his sides heaving, he tossed his head for the last time and left the field of battle. He trailed a cloud of dust across the plains, and Teo saw him disappear into the distant herd of bison. Folt walked over to Teo, followed by Garth and some of the other hunters. The big leader shook his head in amazement. No one has ever defeated Saxton before, he said. He waved his hands towards the hunters. Yet the magic was here for all to see. Teo's hands were shaking. His heart was still pounding. He began to pick up the graven stones and the amulets and the bison horn that had all fallen out of Greybeard's deerskin pouch. He started to tell Volt, well, there really isn't any real magic. But then he remembered Greybeard's voice. If they want to call it magic, Then let him do so. Volt paced up and down, shaking his spear. It is the will of the spirits, he said. They have given the sign, and the word is good. Teo stood quietly, trying to catch his breath as he saw the rest of the hunters climb down from the rim rock. Suddenly, he heard the sound like a muffled thunder rolling across the plains. It came from far off in the direction from which Saxton had gone. A haze of dust rose up all along the horizon as hundreds of great brown bodies came towards them like a gathering storm. It was a living wave of animals, growing larger and larger, shaking the earth. Bolt's eyes grew wide with an alarm. Saxon has stampeded the bison, he shouted. Even now, Teo could see the host of panic-stricken animals rushing towards them, heads bobbing up and down, rows of curved horns flashing in the sunlight. Run! Shouted Bolt. Run! Garth and the hunters ran back, scrambling up the face of the rim rock. Teo wrapped his bad foot around the shaft of the spear and started after them. He gained the top of the rock just as the stampede herd reached the foot of the mound. The mass of the brown, shaggy bodies milled about below them, churning up clouds of dust. Choked and blinded, the fear-crazed beasts ran about in circles, bawling and crashing into one another in a wild melee. Some of the animals, crowded by the ones behind them, were pushed over the edge of the cliff and fell to their deaths on the rocks below. Suddenly, Teo's heart jumped. He did not remember seeing Volt come up to the mound behind him. He looked around, and the big leader was not on the rim rock, nor could he see him in the swirling dust below. Moments passed before the rampaging herd began to collect itself. It turned slowly and began walking across the plains from where it had come. As he turned, Teo saw a gray blur running across the grass. It was Ram! But as Teo started towards him, making his way through the settling of dust, he saw Volt, dazed and shaken, sitting on the ground beside the body of a dead calf. And not too far off was a lone cow bison. It's Maja. Quickly, Teo started down the rock, jumping from ledge to ledge. He tried to hurry, but he was afraid he'd be too late. Halfway down, he saw a gray shadow leap from behind the rock and run with him. It was Ram! Growling and snapping, the wolf dog ran ahead, barking at the shaggy beast, driving it back as Volt got to his feet. From the plain, Teo came up shouting and twirling the pouch. The bison turned, shaking her head, confused and uncertain. Reluctantly, she stepped back, turned, and galloped away across the plains. Teo rushed over to Ram. The wolf dog was slightly gashed on its shoulder. Teo reached down and pulled handfuls of grass to stop the bleeding. Then he threw his arms around the panting animal. Volt's eyes held a wild, vacant stare as he gazed towards the herd of bison, now grazing peacefully in the distance. He looked down at Ram, Then he raised his hairy arms to the sky. "Ha! The curse is over!" he shouted. "It has been lifted from my head. It is an omen, a true sign of the spirits. Yay! Go team!" Teo sat on the ground, his arm around Ram's shoulder. He knew Volt could never change. The demons and spirits would always rule his life. "If I had not seen it with my own eyes," said Volt, "I would have not believed it to be so." He looked down at Teo, a strange new expression on his face. "It is too bad your mother does not live. She would be very happy." Teo turned, surprised by the unexpected words. You knew my Maja?" Volt clasped his two fat hands together and held them up, making a big fist. "I knew your mother when you were no bigger than that," he said. Teo's dark eyes widened. With all of his heart, he wished to know more. "What was she like?" he asked. Volt was silent for a moment. He looked across the high plains, lost in his own thoughts. Then he spoke. "She was a fair and a tall woman, like a young birch tree. She was strong and willful too. She saw things in a way the rest of us didn't always understand." Teo detected a twinge of guilt in the leader's voice, as if the words were hard to say. The big man stared at the boy, studying him for a moment. Then he shrugged. "I will tell you no more," he said. "I will only say this. In many ways, she was much like you." It was the first time Teo had ever heard Volt speak a quiet word. It was strange and unexpected. Yet it was the answer he had been seeking for so long. He watched as the gruff leader walked away, his heart pounding fiercely. He shouted the words, "You are my father!" Volt turned back, brushing his scarred cheek with the back of his hand, glanced over his shoulder, a half smile on his lips as Garth and the other hunters came toward them. "You're a man now," he said. "You no longer need a Faja."